All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amy Woods, the Executive Director of Alumni Relations at Marist and a graduate of the class of 1997. We're very excited to present this webinar to you this afternoon, featuring Elizabeth Clarke and Sandri from the Marist Archives and Special Collections. Before we begin, I'd like to go over some technical notes. If you encounter any audio issues, you do have the option to dial in by telephone. I am going to post right now the call-in information. So if you were able to log in and you see what's going on, you just don't hear everything, you can also dial in by phone so you can hear it a little bit better. And I just put that in the chat box just now. Due to the number of participants who are logging in today, we have muted all lines except for the host. So we're going to reserve that chat box for technical questions you might have for the Marist staff. Please do not send private messages to Anne or Elizabeth, as it is difficult for them to check those while they are doing the presentation. So instead, please use the Q&A feature to send any questions you have about the actual presentation to the host, myself or Jamie Bauer, and we will provide those questions to Anne and Elizabeth. There are several ways you can view the presentation within this WebEx product. If you hover over the center of the presentation, little icons should pop up that change your view. I know I have a floating panel view, I have a side-by-side view, and a video strip view. So usually video strip view or side-by-side are preferred when you're viewing both the video camera and the PowerPoint presentation. So you can determine that on your own. We should be, I think we're posting a brief survey at the conclusion of this webinar. It'll pop up in a different tab in your browser, just a 5-question survey to ask, how you enjoy this, if it worked well for you, and if I have ideas for future events. So that'd be very helpful to us. So today we had over 130 folks register for this webinar. We have over 100 right now logged in. And they're from all over the country. So of course we have the tri-state area represented, but in addition to that, we have folks from Texas, California, Georgia, Ohio, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, Illinois, North Carolina. So Anne and Elizabeth, they're very interested in this topic. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Elizabeth Clarke is the librarian assistant for the Archives and Special Collections at Marist, and Anne Sandri is the librarian assistant for also Archives and Special Collections at Marist. So thank you in advance for sharing this collection with us and everything you know.
Okay. All right, so I guess without further ado, we'll get started. So today's presentation is kind of more about what Anne and I have been doing for Archives and Special Collections for the last 6 years. We'll touch on briefly bits of Poughkeepsie Regatta history, but we really want to share with you what we've been doing and what is available in the Archives and Special Collections. So just a brief introduction to the Poughkeepsie Regatta. So before the turn of the 20th century, a major college rowing competition was held on the Hudson River and would become known as the Poughkeepsie Regatta. It was started by the universities of Columbia, Cornell, and Pennsylvania, and it grew to feature crews from across the country and brought thousands of spectators to the area. The Poughkeepsie Regatta came to be known as the National Rowing Championship, rivaling the Harvard, Yale, and even the Henley Regattas in the UK. So why does Marist have a collection about the Poughkeepsie Regatta? Well, the primary reason being that we own the last boathouse built for the Poughkeepsie Regatta, the historic Cornell Boathouse. The other reason is that we actually have a fair amount of collections in the Archives and Special Collections dealing with local history. So we have several from Jonah Sherman that documents a lot of the businesses in Poughkeepsie, as well as photographs, historic postcards, and more. And finally, this has actually been a major interest of President Murray. He's always been a huge supporter of Archives and Special Collections, and he's actually shown a particular interest in the Poughkeepsie Regatta and documenting its history. So, how did we go about building this collection? When Anne and I started, there were about 2 boxes of primarily Poughkeepsie Regatta programs with a few other artifacts. And one of the goals of our project was to find more artifacts relating to this event's history. So we actually had some documentation from those who had put together the existing collection, and they led us to digital collections that were available at the New York Public Library and the National Archives. And so we really started with the bigger institutions that we were able to get access to easily online. As we worked through this project, we ended up connecting with a lot of local history groups, including the Town of Lloyd historian, Adrienne's Memorial Library, and Vivian Waterland, who works with the historical groups in the Town of Lloyd and Highland. And a lot of them are really willing to share their collection with us and work with us. And we actually, were able to create these relationships with them. And they taught us a lot about the history of the area, as well as, us teaching them about what they had within their collections. We were able to provide more information to them so that they could help people who were interested in researching the history of their area, as well as looking at their collections. So we have a few slides of some of the materials we got from each of these places. So these are from the Library of Congress. The Library of Congress received a donation of glass plate negatives from George McBain's news service, who just had collections of photos from various events around the country, important people, and they had begun digitizing them. And these are really, just moments in time in this much larger collection that the Library of Congress has, but we knew what they were and knew that they could be used to help us tell the story. So we were able to get many of these images and use them to show a part of the regatta's history that we wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. We got a much smaller collection of photos from the New York Public Library. They didn't have quite as much depth as the Library of Congress, as I think they were donated, by individuals and not by an entire news service. But the great thing about these is that we got a lot of photos from early on in the regatta, things that the Library of Congress didn't have. So you'll see in the middle top, the photograph of Cornell from 1896. And then we have Syracuse in the my upper right corner from 1904, one of the first times they were at Poughkeepsie. And then on the bottom right, we have a photograph of Cornell from 1897. So very early photos that the Library of Congress did not have. And once we started working with the local historical groups, we got really interesting stuff that added context from the region. In the case of New York Public Library and Library of Congress, we were adding context. We were adding more details to the materials we received from them. Whereas our connections with Adrienne's Memorial Library and the Town of Lloyd historian, which we'll see in a second, gave us context for the area. So for Adrienne's, we got an entire set of photographs from the same year of each team, something we rarely find anywhere, which was really nice. But what was great about this, if you look at the middle image, the picture of the piece of paper, there was a local committee that was involved in putting together the Poughkeepsie Regatta. This is a piece of their letterhead, and it's a fundraising letter. There is no other institution that we've come across that has one of these. And it added this really nice, rich depth to what we could, tell about this event. And then we connected with a wonderful woman named Vivian Waterland through the Hudson Valley Institute. She had worked with them digitizing several images from her collection. And we got to go and visit her. And she shared with us a number of pictures of boarding houses in Highland that crews stayed at. But what was really great about connecting with Vivian is that she was able to tell us a lot about one of the places they stayed, Villa. And what was great about this was Bellevue was built and on the site where Vivian lives now. we actually got to see a piece of the foundation that's left from the burning. As you see, there's a newspaper article about when it burned down from 1904. And we got to actually look and get a sense of where it stood in the relation to the rest of the regatta and where it sat in relation to Marist as well. And Vivian not only lives on the site of Belvedere from the people who originally owned it, so it was really nice to connect with her and give her this information about her family's property and tell her when the crews had stayed there and, you know, what crews had stayed there. And then one of our, I will say probably one of the most fun adventures was to go to the town of Lloyd historian's office, who very generously allowed us to borrow their entire box of materials on the Poughkeepsie Regatta. And the great thing about this was it actually gave us the full Highland perspective. It's known as the Poughkeepsie Regatta, and Highland often gets left out. And Highland had an enormous impact in supporting the regatta, hosting the regatta, that you don't often see in a lot of the newspaper writing or even the film footage. So we have these great photos taken from the Highland Shore, not from the observation train, which we'll talk about in more detail later, but, you know, sitting on the banks watching the crews race down, and you can see the car bridge in one of the photographs. You can see where they parked their cars along the river to watch the race. These were things that we didn't have in any other place or even within the items that we had, you know, found elsewhere. So in addition to connecting with these historic groups and, you know, larger institutions, we actually did a fair amount of purchasing to acquire artifacts for the collection. As you know, as newspapers have divested themselves of their photograph archives, they've sold them off to individuals, to retailers who have now made them available for sale through eBay, Etsy, and other antique outlets. And so we've acquired a large number of photographs for this collection, not only through donation and sharing with other institutions, but also through purchase. So we've been able to document the history in image pretty thoroughly as a result of this. But it's also resulted in us finding the other artifacts that are within the collection. We have a uniform from 1908. You can see that on the bottom. We have equipment. We have trophies. We have rowing memorabilia, as well as advertisements for the races, advertisements about rowing, and it's added to the depth of what we have, as well as taught us a lot about, you know, how they advertise this event, how they encourage people to be interested in the sport of rowing. In addition to purchasing, we've had a few donations. As I said earlier, we have almost a complete set of programs from 1921 to 1949 as a result of people donating programs to the archives. We also were lucky enough to get a donation of 5 oars from various institutions that were given to someone locally. So we've been building the collection through purchase, donation, as well as, you know, connecting with these groups so that we can build a collection that works really well. The last thing we want to actually share with you, because we do have film footage within our collection, is film footage from the 1934 Poughkeepsie Regatta. And there is no sound on this video.
So Elizabeth, what year was this video from?
It's from 1934. Passengers on the observation train, as well as the crews. And as you look at the footage, as the shots from the observation train towards the river, you'll see black lines. Those are telephone or telegraph lines. Often a question I get asked.
Roller coaster.
And there's the roller coaster from the pleasure park that was on Marist property. So in this project, we've tried to develop a cohesive collection covering all of the universities that participated. If you look at the slide, we have a number of institutions who participated and have put together exhibits or collections online about their cruise. So if you go to Cornell, you can find a ton about Cornell. You go to Columbia, you'll find a ton about Columbia. But there's no one who has tried to put together anything on this event. So we've tried to actually document the event, which does include all of these universities, but try to make it about all of them and not one or two as these universities would do. We'll share these links at the end of the presentation if you want to go and take a look at them in more detail. But our goal is trying to make this the biggest collection about the Poughkeepsie Regatta. The second part of this project was to develop a comprehensive and detailed history of the regatta at Poughkeepsie. Prior research and prior work had developed a broad overview of the regatta, but there were a lot of questions that hadn't been asked or had been unanswered. So we actually, spent a lot of time researching, not only in newspapers, but also, at the objects themselves have helped us, document what happened. So our first part of this research was to go and look through local newspapers. Prior to this, they had looked at the New York Times, which is a great resource. It's a New York State newspaper, but it was very much a national coverage of the event, whereas we wanted Poughkeepsie and Highland's perspective on the event, because it didn't just appear on the Hudson for one day. They had to do some preparation. And our research revealed quite a bit about that, but a whole bunch of other things as well. So the first thing we documented in thorough detail was who rode here. We made sure we had a list of every university who put in an appearance and every year that they came. We also tried to document the individuals, because as you can see in these photos, they're all in group shots and you don't necessarily know who everyone is if you look at the back of these photos. Sometimes there's a really thorough caption, sometimes there's very little information. So we wanted to try and put, if we could, names to faces as much as possible, make them less anonymous, and also to help with people who had genealogy questions about their ancestors who had rowed at the regatta. And we've already fielded several, actually, from people who really wanted to know, oh, did he actually row here? And who did he row for, and what position? And we also discovered that a couple famous people actually rowed for a couple of these crews. Gregory Peck being the most famous, who rowed for the University of California. He was actually a substitute and did not row at Poughkeepsie in the actual race, but he was here. We also thoroughly documented who coached them. And the thing about these coaches, these were coaches who set precedents in the world of rowing. Their names are not necessarily as famous today, but these were the premier coaches during this time period. They invented techniques that were named after them. If you look at the bottom at Charles Courtney, he invented what's called the Courtney stroke. A number of them coached Olympic teams. Dick Glendon from Naval Academy coached them, naval crew to victory in the 1920 Olympics. Ty Ebright of California coached crews in the 1928, 1932, and 1948 Olympics. And Al Ulbrichson, of course, coached the famous one in Germany. So these were premier rowers, premier coaches, but they were also rowers in their own right. A number of them rowed as part of university crews, and a number of them were professional rowers themselves and had actually made a career, and that led them to be hired as coaches at universities. And probably the most undocumented piece of our project before we started this is where the crews actually stayed. There's a lot of information about what crews use which boat houses on Regatta Row, was part of, on the Marist property, but there's not a lot of information beyond that because those boathouses were not built until the 1930s. So one of the most surprising and fulfilling parts of this project has been actually investigating where they stayed when those boathouses didn't exist and how they got down to the river from those places. Because some of them stayed on the other side of Poughkeepsie near Vassar College. Some of them stayed in the middle of Highland in the case of the Elms. So it was nice to get this historic context for these buildings and make connections to the area beyond the river, because a lot of photographs are taken on the water and you don't see that these crews return to the middle of Highland or Poughkeepsie. And we also did a lot of work to figure out what buildings were still standing, how they'd been changed, and it added to our knowledge of local history as well. And then one of the other things that we really wanted to document is make sure that we had a full accounting of what races took place and who actually won them. So we documented, we were able to find a lot of the times for every single contestant. We also discovered that an entire race that was held, the Varsity Four, was not documented. The Varsity Four took place between 1899 and 1913, but we didn't have any information on it in our records, so we were able to put that together. So it was good to have this information. So if we had questions, people wanted to know when people competed, we had a full set of information for this. And then we also have all these anonymous photographs of people in boats, in cars, along the river, on the observation train, as you can see. But we didn't really have a lot of names to go with them. So the various ways that they did, but who actually attended. And, you know, there were a lot of, you know, still anonymous local folks who came and stood along the riverbank between the train tracks and the water, or gathered at viewing parties on the lawn of people's conveniently placed houses along the river. But we also had, you know, alumni from various universities who poured into the city or lived locally, as well as politicians and dignitaries. Among the most famous to attend the races include Franklin Delano Roosevelt as governor and president, as well as his Levi Morton, Lou Nova, a famous boxer in the 30s. John Astor and his son Vincent regularly came down from Rhinebeck to attend, and even more. And the final thing that really, as I referenced earlier, that really came up in this is how involved people were locally, and not just as spectators. They formed groups to actually support the regatta, plan the regatta, and map out the course. And one of the things that was really great when we went to the town of Lloyd historian's office is one of them was descended from one of these locals who helped place buoys, who helped measure and draft out the course and mark it so that the race could go off, as well as the fundraising they did. So there was a lot going on behind the scenes that Poughkeepsie and Highland were involved in that you don't see in these beautiful photographs. So it was a nice way to connect Poughkeepsie and Highland more concretely to this event beyond serving as the stage for it. They did far more than that. So that's the end of my presentation in terms of content. At this point, you can't come and see us on the first floor of the James A. Candevino Library. We hope to see you again soon. But we do have seeing more. There is actually a great deal more research to be done and more materials to be acquired. We have a great deal of radio coverage we want to go looking for, as well as some film footage. And we have several research institutions that we need to connect with to see what we can find. So this is an ongoing project, and we always are looking to add more knowledge to what we have. We will be putting together a new website about the Poughkeepsie Regatta soon. We're working on that over the summer, so we will let you know when that's available. And we actually, Anne and I have an article in the fall issue of the Hudson River Valley Review that gives a very nice sketch of how the Poughkeepsie Regatta came to be and what it meant to this area. So if you have any questions, I guess we can start taking questions, Amy.
Okay, I'm looking over in the Q&A box. We had someone mention that there's a joint venture between the Hudson River Association and the MidHudson Rowing Association to host the Poughkeepsie Regatta once again each September.
Oh.
So that would be cool, yes, because I know we did do one a few years back.
I think we've done at least 3. I think there was one in 2009, 10, and 12.
I know it's difficult to get some other colleges to come row on our river. That's always the challenge.
That was sort of the challenge behind keeping it. Hudson River is a challenge to row on at points.
Okay. And that was from Josh. I know he's helping coach at Marist. Let's see. Anything else? Anyone online have a question? Feel free to put it in the Q&A box. I'll check it right now. I'm just checking the chat box as well. And I wanted to let everyone know that this webinar has been recorded. So within a few days, when we can download it from the system, we will post it on our website. So if you joined late, you can still catch everything, or if you know someone who might have missed it. Okay. We have a few things that just came into let me go through them for you here. What was significant about Poughkeepsie as to why it was selected as a site?
Well, that's a really good question. So a couple of reasons that they selected Poughkeepsie over other locations, and they did look at other places when it first started. They liked the fact that no one had this as their home course, that it was neutral territory. No one was accustomed to rowing here. They also liked the fact that it was a relatively straight section of 4 miles, because that was the goal for the first regatta. They frequently rowed 4 miles at New London, Connecticut, but the course curved, and that was they didn't like that. So they liked the fact that it was relatively straight here. And I think the big reason that they chose Poughkeepsie, and this is talked about a number of times, is the fact that it was really easy to have people view the race. They could run a train on the west side of the river near Highland, and they could also have people, easily have boats on the course and view the race and not be in the way, as well as gather on the sides of the river, on the shores, to watch the race, because the banks naturally curve down towards the river. It's a very good spot. They looked at other places on the Hudson River.
Are you typing? I can hear typing.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, yeah.
No. Like they looked at other places on the river and on the Hudson River, as well as other locations in other states, and this was the best one that they thought would work.
That answered another question, actually. It was, what side was the passenger train on? So that was one of the questions. About how many people? Was there any, how many attended?
It's estimated, depending upon the year, between tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands. There are some years where it's heavily attended, other years not as heavily, but there's usually, tens of thousands at least.
And there's a few questions I think you touched on a little, but when it ended, and what were the reasons for it ending?
Okay, so part of the reason actually was the Hudson River. They often had trouble with the tides. It would, make it hard to schedule the race because they would want to schedule it, so that the tide was good for all. And sometimes a matter of an hour's difference in scheduling the race would actually make it very difficult to row. And they opted to move the regatta in 1949 to Marietta because it was not a tidal river. The Ohio River didn't have the same mercurial moves that the Hudson has. There was also an issue involving the observation train that ran on along the river. They couldn't get one after a car shortage, and they had broken up the one that they used for regattas and had put it into use around the country. All the cars had been repurposed for regular shipping and transit, so they couldn't get one. And the universities made money off of those tickets, so when they couldn't get one for several years, they weren't terribly happy about it. And then one of the big reasons that they were upset was that in the last few years of the regatta, instead of having crews stay in boarding houses and having their own individual boat houses around the Hudson River, they had them all sharing two schools or more to a boathouse. And it was really cramped. And the city wouldn't build any more buildings there on Regatta Row. So when Marietta came to them in 1949, they offered them the dorms at the University of Ohio. And that was really appealing because that would mean they wouldn't have to all be crammed in together.
Do you know if the regatta just moved somewhere else afterward? Was it the final competition in the big one in the nation for college rowing, or did it pick up somewhere else afterward?
So they held the regatta in Marietta, Ohio for a couple years after it left Poughkeepsie. It then moved to Syracuse, and it was at Syracuse for quite a while on Onondaga Lake. It continues to be run today. Today it's known as the IRA. It's a different style of race. They changed how they run it, but currently it rotates locations. It usually rotates between New Jersey and California. I think there's a third place. I don't remember exactly where. So they never stopped holding the regatta. They just stopped having it at Poughkeepsie.
Okay. Yeah, I think that was the question. Great. Anne, you want me to open that poll question right now?
Yeah, I think that was great. Thanks.
Okay. So for those who are viewing from the computer that didn't call in, you should have seen a poll pop up on your screen that Anne and Elizabeth would like your feedback on. So I'm going to leave that open, and it'll be open for about 5 minutes if you'd like to answer that. Let me go back to any questions. Let's see. I'm flip-flopping between chat and Q&A. Some people have put it in there. Let's see. Last slideshow. Cars parked on narrow road above river. Is that the Cornell Boathouse? So the last slideshow showed cars parked on a narrow road above the river. Was that above the Cornell Boathouse?
No, that's actually in Highland.
Okay. Gotcha. And someone asked the difference between the town of Lloyd and Highland, or the relationship.
Okay, that is a very good question. So the way New York State organizes things, there's the village of Highland, which was heavily involved in the regatta, which is within the larger town of Lloyd. So all historical materials relating to Highland and Lloyd are kept at the town of Lloyd historian's office. Sorry for that. That's really confusing. We apologize.
I kind of live in a town like that has a village and a town. If some folks from the area have trophies, programs, or other material related to the Poughkeepsie Regatta, how would they be able to share that with you?
So we have 3 email addresses on the last slide. You are more than welcome to email us about them, and we can discuss what you want to do with that memorabilia.
And in general, to your archives, Are they available outside of the current pandemic going on? So we'll say when that's slowed up. Is it available? Are the items available at any time for viewing?
Digitally, I have access to all of the Poughkeepsie Regatta images, and we have photographs that we've taken of the objects. So if somebody would like to see more images on a specific team or place or coach, I do have the ability to pull them up and share them. So.
Someone has asked, have you ever been able to locate any personal stories as told by the oarsmen who actually rowed at this regatta?
We have a small handful of oral histories and things that we've been able to locate, most of which are available online. A few of the rowers actually wrote pieces for magazines and newspapers, so those are available as well.
Okay. You know where on the river the course was laid out, where the finish line was?
The finish line was below what is now the MidHudson Bridge. So the bridge that cars use, not the walkway over the Hudson.
Gotcha. Let's see. So the old boathouses, they were essentially used during the period of the regatta, but then they sat empty the rest of the year? I always had that question too.
It's a very good question. There were 3 boathouses in total. The Cornell Boathouse did not sit empty the rest of the year. They actually rented it out for events. We have a number of, we've done some research on this, and they had a number of private parties there, organizations held events there. The other 2 were sometimes used by high schools. In later years, they were used exclusively by high schools. But I think for the rest of the year, for most of the year, the other 2 sat empty, which belonged to the University of Washington and the University of California, Berkeley.
For the person that asked how they can, Anne and Elizabeth can be reached for the digital collection, it is on the screen right now, their email addresses and the phone number for the archives, but we will be sending out a follow-up email to all of you who have joined today. We can include that information again for you. It'll also include the link to the page where this will be posted afterward. So if you don't get it off the screen right now, some people like to take a screenshot with their camera when they see the slides. So you can do that if you have your phone with you. Otherwise, we will send it to you. I think I got most. I mean, there are some comments also, which we will save for Anne and Elizabeth after.
Someone wanted to know if we listed the schools that participated over time, but what schools or teams were in the first race.
Okay.
It was the University of Columbia, Cornell, and UPenn. Not to be confused with Penn State, University of Pennsylvania.
All right. And I think the poll just closed, but I can share that, Anne and Elizabeth, with you after. It was about hosting a future. So, of course, the majority said yes.
Thank you all for responding to the poll.
66 out of 100 said yes.
There's actually a question also. Was there sports betting on the regatta? Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And there were various attempts to shut it down all the time, and it never really worked. It was a thing that went on, and nobody could stop it. We do not have a copy of Ed Fitchett's film. We've actually tried to get in contact with him. So if anybody knows how to reach Ed Fitchett, please share.
And I'm going to type in the chat box for everyone that web address where they can find this webinar afterward. You link it from the Marist Connect site. Actually, events, recordings. And we host everything on the Marist Alumni YouTube channel afterward. So this is the address to the alumni site where we host all of our webinars, links to them, and it'll link you over to our YouTube site so you can view them. One more just came in, Elizabeth. How early would the schools arrive and practice prior to the regatta? Not sure if you know.
Yeah, they would come usually a couple of weeks before because they wanted to be able to practice for some time and get settled in. So they would definitely come a couple weeks before the scheduled races.
It would also depend upon their academic
Someone
schedule.
is actually asking if they can help volunteer with the research.
I have no problem with that. I would love to have help.
Yeah.
The crews, it would depend, as I said, for how long they would train upon their final schedule. Some of them would finish their finals before they would take them on the train. It all depended upon what the schedule was and what the choice of the university administration was. Columbia typically arrived first. They came always very early, but it was usually the first week of June was typically when you'd start to see them come. And the question, were the races typically held in June, mid-June to early July? It all depended upon, again, the academic schedule and if they could get the tides to cooperate on the day they had in mind.
See any others? Elizabeth in there that
I can't
got most.
it's cut off my view. I can't see some of the earlier ones.
Okay. I think we might have gotten the early ones. I know. Here's something. Hold on. What month were the races held in?
Typically mid-June, early July. They rarely went beyond the first week of July.
Okay.
Most likely because of the 4th of July. People didn't want to infringe on that celebration.
I think Jamie just had the boys in the boat. Yeah, someone is just pointing out that the boys in the boat does have a lot of anecdotal information about the regatta if folks haven't read.
He did a lot with the oral histories from University of Washington, which we've not had a chance to take a look at.
All right.
How were the boats shipped? Oh, I love that question.
Mhm.
They actually would have to have a car designated for those
A train car.
a train car.
Not a car.
They weren't driving with trailers then. They would ship them by train. And they were usually, the ones that we've seen where they're unpacking it would be open train cars where they would be strapped down.
So that in response to the train cars, one of our graduates, who we know really well from the famous class of '69, said it's interesting to note that the New York City Railroad did not have viewing train cars. They rented them from the New Haven Railroad Company, who used them at New London.
Yes, they would often, that train would often travel between Poughkeepsie and New London for the different races.
Wow.
How are the race lanes marked? They usually put, the early ones were marked with buoys made of casks, like, casks for holding water, different types of goods, and then they were painted. But they would mark them quite clearly to start. I don't know precisely how they marked them in later years, but they used buoys of different kinds.
Okay, I think we talked about did we? I know we talked about the training in Poughkeepsie. I know we had a question how long they would train in Poughkeepsie. I know we talked about how early they came, right?
Yes.
So did they stay long after?
Typically not. Oftentimes they would, some crews, depending upon where they came from, would go down to New York City for an event. When Stanford University came in 1915, they stayed and went down to New York City. I think a lot of the Western crews wouldn't leave the area immediately because they'd have a long journey home. So a lot of the more local crews like Cornell and Columbia would leave like the next day and go back home. They didn't typically stay in the area very long.
I know
because it was time for summer break at this point.
I know we answered which side they viewed from, which the west side. Do you know if folks also viewed from what is now the walkway, the railroad bridge?
Some years they were allowed to, other years they were not. It all depended upon what trains were running that day.
They would hold viewing parties on the lawn at Vassar
Hospital.
That was a big thing. They had an unobstructed view. So.
And they only ran one train on one side of the river. The course tended to be closer to the Highland side, the western side of the river, so that the observation train had optimal viewing for the race. And when one race ended, they would just pull it back up to the race. So it would basically go up and down the same track for the several hours that the races were held.
I guess today they're limited to 6 boat lanes. Do you know how many were on that course back then?
In 1949, they ran 12 because that's how many universities participated.
Someone's asking if you're planning to put all this into a book.
And I see who that's from too. Yes, Vivian, we're going to write a book.
Oh, I just saw the name. Hi, Vivian.
Used to be professional rowers. Was that very prevalent? In the early years, the coaches, yes, because there weren't a lot of crew members who went into coaching after graduation. There were a lot of professional rowers who became coaches. As time went on and the rowing programs expanded at universities, a lot more people who had formerly rowed as university rowers became coaches. University of Washington is pretty famous for turning out tons of coaches.
All right. We got most.
I think so.
And as I mentioned, we can share contact information with everyone. So if they come up with a question afterward, very easy to get in touch with you.
Were there scholarships? You know, I don't actually know the answer to that question.
All right.
I think that would depend upon the university, the individual universities. I don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah, I would assume in regards to the actual regatta, the school was paying for all, the students to come out there as they do today to compete. But
I think there was one instance where a smaller, not as well funded crew program had to pay their own way.
Okay.
But there was a lot of fundraising done to attend the regatta. We have a number of buttons from different schools where the students actually fundraise to fund the trip. In terms of rowing scholarships, I think it probably depended upon the size of the program, if they offered that. But I don't know with any degree of certainty.
All right. And Elizabeth, are you good?
Yeah.
That was wonderful.
Questions?
It was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we had over 120 folks today. Popular Wednesday afternoon. So thank you, everyone. As I mentioned, we'll send out a link in addition to the one I put in the chat box and where you can find this later, and feel free to send us any questions afterward, but we appreciate your time, and everyone have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.